Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight we're walking through Victorian London, a city that built the modern world on the smallest of shoulders. Beneath the gaslight and grandeur were thousands of children who worked, coughed and vanished before they ever grew up. For Victorians, this was not cruelty, it was progress. This is the dark history of child labour in Victorian London. Before we start, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you'd prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. I've linked my favourite pair plus other sleep tools in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable, let's begin. London in the middle of the 19th century moved like a machine that had learned to breathe. Its pulse was the clatter of wheels on cobblestone, the hiss of steam, and the steady thrum of factory whistles echoing across the Thames. Smoke poured from 1,000 chimneys and refused to drift away. It sank into lungs, curtains, and clothes until breath itself smelled of coal. The air, people said, was the scent of progress, though progress tasted of soot and iron. From a distance, the city seemed triumphant. Warehouses, rail stations, and spires rose from the fog like proof of divine favour. Ships pressed against the docks, decks stacked with the empire's harvest, tea, cotton, sugar, while cranes screeched and men shouted through the din. By daylight, the Thames glistened with oil. By night, it mirrored rows of gas lamps burning without pause. London called itself the capital of civilization, but its civilization ran on exhaustion. Wealth showed itself only in glimpses: polished brass signs, carriages behind high walls, rooms where the curtains never opened. For every chandelier in Mayfair, 10 tenements in Whitechapel sweated and coughed beneath leaking roofs. Whole families shared single rooms where laundry never dried, and children slept beside the stove for warmth. The same rain that rinsed Westminster washed sewage through the slums. Industry was hunger made permanent. Factories beat like iron hearts along the city's edge, their windows glowing late into the night. Inside, machines roared louder than voices. Workers moved with mechanical rhythm, their bodies timed to the pistons. The streets outside were their extension, sweepers clearing mud for pennies, costermongers shouting prices, laundresses hammering linen long after dark. London did not rest, and those who could not keep up simply vanished into its noise. Prosperity fed on poverty. The city's chimneys and ledgers were built on lives measured in hours. Hunger kept the engines turning. Virtue was redefined as endurance. Gentlemen praised the dignity of labour, though they never touched the work themselves. They called London tireless, as if that were a compliment. In truth, its energy was borrowed from those with nothing left to give. Among them were the youngest, already learning that the city's strength depended on how early a person began to earn it. Poverty in Victorian London did not arrive suddenly. It was inherited, passed down like the colour of one's eyes or the shape of a family's nose. A child's future was decided long before birth, written into the ledger of rent and wages that ruled every household. The city's progress demanded labour faster and cheaper than any adult could supply alone, and so the smallest bodies became the simplest solution. In a city where survival required constant motion, childhood itself became an indulgence few could afford. For most families, the mathematics of the survival left no room for sentiment. A father's earnings from the docks or the workshop might cover rent, but little else. Meat was a Sunday privilege, coal a weekly gamble. Mothers took in washing or sewing, their fingers raw from soap and thread, yet the margin between subsistence and starvation was still narrow enough to measure in pennies. A single illness, a broken tool, or a day of missed work could erase a month's stability. In such arithmetic, A child's labour was not exploitation, it was insurance. Even a few coins earned sweeping crossings or selling matches might mean another day with bread. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act had redrawn the moral landscape of poverty. It declared that relief should be offered only within the walls of the workhouse, where conditions were deliberately worse than any available job. To be poor was now a character flaw, proof of idleness or vice. Parliament insisted that charity encouraged dependency. Work, however degrading, was to be the new salvation. The result was predictable. The poor avoided relief at any cost, fearing the humiliation of being torn from their families and confined behind institutional gates. To stay free meant to work, and to work meant everyone worked, including the children. Within this logic, necessity disguised itself as virtue. Employers praised the industry of the young, preachers celebrated the discipline of early labour, and politicians boasted that England's greatness lay in its industrious youth. A boy who began sweeping at 7 was said to be building character. A girl who stitched from dawn to dusk was called dutiful. The reality was simpler and harder. Without their wages, their families would not eat. Society mistook endurance for morality and hunger for ambition. The city itself reinforced the lesson. Posters and sermons warned against idleness, as if rest were a sin. Schools that admitted the poor taught obedience before literacy, training children to bow to the rhythm of the machine rather than question it. When reformers suggested that education might be a better foundation than labour, employers accused them of undermining discipline. A generation of children learned to measure their worth not in knowledge or play, but in hours worked and pain endured without complaint. Domestic work blurred the boundary between home and employment. Children fetched water, scrubbed floors, and mended garments before they could write their names. Boys carried messages for shopkeepers or sorted scrap metal for their fathers. Girls helped their mothers stitch shirts for pennies apiece. The home became an extension of the factory, filled with the same tired hands and dim light. The idea of leisure was foreign, reserved for the wealthy who could afford to call work vocation. Among the poor, usefulness was the only virtue left. Even those who employed children often defended it as benevolence. Factory owners argued that early labour kept youngsters from crime, that wages, no matter how meagre, taught thrift and self-respect. Middle-class observers wrote sentimental sketches of happy apprentices, as though poverty were a moral adventure. Few ventured into the alleys where those apprentices slept, or considered what became of them when their smallness ceased to be profitable. It was easier to imagine childhood as a phase of training than to face the truth that, for most, it was a lifetime compressed into a few short years. Statistics offered a form of comfort for the well-intentioned. Reports counted bodies with the same detachment used for coal shipments or grain imports. Inspectors noted that children as young as 6 worked 12-hour days in certain districts, but praised the decline of infant labour as evidence of progress. The language of numbers created distance, turning misery into data. What could not be quantified, the ache in small joints, the fear of punishment, the dull acceptance of fatigue, slipped quietly between the columns. Religious institutions struggled with the contradiction. Clergymen preached compassion on Sundays, then blessed the discipline of labour on Mondays. Some saw the child worker as a symbol of purity, persevering through hardship. Others viewed poverty itself as divine correction. Either way, the suffering of the young was transformed into moral spectacle. The same city that condemned idleness in sermons filled its pews with parishioners who lived off the labour of those too young to attend church. The cycle of poverty reinforced itself with mechanical precision. Children who worked from dawn to dusk grew into adults without education, limited to the same unstable trades as their parents. Their wages, too low to sustain a family, ensured that their own children would soon join them. Each generation fed the next into the machine, while reformers debated whether intervention might encourage laziness. The system did not need to change, it only needed to continue. Poverty became a self-sustaining resource, reliable, renewable, and profitable. Yet within this bleak math, there persisted a quiet pride. Parents told themselves that work built strength, that hardship would teach their children resilience. They hoped endurance might be a form of inheritance more valuable than property. The truth was crueler. Endurance only prolonged survival within the same confines. No amount of diligence could buy freedom from a society that had redefined virtue as submission. Among the many trades that defined early Victorian London, none was more infamous or more quietly accepted than chimney sweeping. It was dirty work, dangerous work, and therefore perfectly suited to those with no other options. By the middle of the 19th century, the sight of a small boy emerging from a soot-stained rooftop before sunrise had become so familiar that few Londoners still found it remarkable. These children were called climbing boys, though the term disguised more than it revealed. They were not apprentices in the hopeful sense, but possessions, rented, bought, or inherited by men who called themselves masters. Their work began while the city still slept. In the chill hours before dawn, the boys were shaken awake, coughing before they even left their beds of rags. Each was given a cap, a scraper, and a brush, along with a promise of food once the day was done. The smallest children were valued most. A narrow chest and thin shoulders could reach corners a grown man's tools could not. A good climber could sweep 4 or 5 houses before breakfast. They worked quickly, moving from one home to the next while the streets were still dim with fog and coal smoke. Wealthier families disliked meeting their sweepers in daylight. It was easier to imagine the chimneys cleaned by some anonymous mechanism than by the small blackened figures who vanished down the flues. Inside the chimney, the world reduced itself to darkness, weight, and breath. A flue might narrow to 9 inches across, twisting like a corridor designed for pain. The boys climbed barefoot and nearly naked, pressing their backs and knees against the brick to gain purchase. Soot rained down around them, filling their mouths and eyes. A misjudged movement could trap them. A startled bird or loose brick might send them tumbling. The soot burned where it touched bare skin, leaving sores that never fully healed. When they reached the top, their faces would emerge first, 2 blinking eyes in a mask of black dust, before they hauled themselves into the grey light. Then they slid back down, emptied the soot into their sacks, and prepared for the next climb. Accidents were so common, they had their own vocabulary. A boy who suffocated mid-flue was said to be stuck, and another would be sent in after him to pull him free. Deaths by fire were rarer but more spectacular. If a household forgot to extinguish the hearth before a sweep began, flames could surge upward, faster than the child could escape. Neighbours spoke afterward of the screams echoing through the walls, of smoke turning briefly human before dispersing, yet these horrors seldom made it beyond rumour. A dead climbing boy was easily replaced, and the soot that killed him would be brushed away before morning. The relationship between master and child was an uneasy mixture of dependence and control. Most masters had once been sweeps themselves, their cruelty shaped by the same apprenticeship they now inflicted. They offered shelter, food, and the illusion of protection, calling their boys my lads or my family. In return, they demanded obedience and endless labour. Beatings were frequent, sometimes justified as discipline, sometimes as instruction. A disobedient boy might be punished by being forced up a flue still warm from the previous night's fire. Others were kept hungry to ensure compliance. A weak child was pliant, less likely to run. Some masters claimed affection for their charges, and might even mean it, but affection did not interfere with profit. Reformers occasionally discovered these children in their rounds of the slums and wrote about them with shocked fascination. The accounts spoke of sores, burns, stunted growth, and a distinctive posture, the spine curved forward, shoulders permanently drawn inward from years of climbing. Doctors described soot warts, a form of cancer that appeared on the skin where soot collected. The disease was so common among chimney sweeps that it became one of the first occupational illnesses ever identified. Such findings horrified polite society, but rarely changed behaviour. A machine capable of cleaning chimneys without human bodies had been invented decades earlier, yet most households refused it. The mechanical brush required preparation and patience. A child required only payment. Tradition, convenience, and the comforting belief that poverty made labour virtuous all combined to keep the children in place. Legislation arrived slowly. Like all reform in the empire, the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1834 prohibited the use of boys under 10, though enforcement was almost non-existent. Later acts raised the minimum age and introduced fines, but every clause contained exceptions broad enough to drive a cart through. The profession endured by moving inward, away from official scrutiny, and into the warren of private homes where inspectors seldom ventured. For every child who escaped through a charity or reformer's intervention, another took his place from an orphanage or poorhouse. The cycle continued, soot layered upon soot, until the city itself seemed to breathe it. In public, Victorians spoke of the climbing boys with a mixture of pity and pride. They admired the courage of children who faced darkness daily, calling them symbols of British fortitude. Their suffering was sentimentalised in prints and songs, often sold to the same households that employed them. Charity events collected donations to clothe the boys, though no one suggested hiring fewer of them. The problem was acknowledged, mourned, and then quietly maintained. The children themselves had little to say. Their voices, hoarse from soot and exhaustion, carried nowhere. Life expectancy for a climbing boy was measured not in years but in chimneys. Those who survived their apprenticeships often graduated to other forms of low work, sweeping streets, hauling coal, cleaning sewers, trades that still demanded endurance without offering stability. Few ever learned to read. Their bodies, bent and scarred, carried the history of labour more vividly than any law could record. When they finally aged out of usefulness, they disappeared into the general population of the poor, indistinguishable from those who had never climbed at all. To middle-class Londoners, the sweep became part of the city's scenery, another moving shadow in the fog, another reminder of industry's reach. Soot was everywhere, on windowsills, in teacups, in lungs, and few stopped to ask where it came from. The air that made London powerful was the same air that destroyed its children, yet the connection was too ordinary to notice. A clean chimney meant warmth, safety, and domestic respectability. The blackened hands that provided it were an afterthought. The factory was the cathedral of Victorian labour, and its hymn was noise. From dawn until deep into the evening, the air inside a London mill or workshop trembled with the rhythm of machinery. The sound was not a collection of parts, but a single living pulse, a mechanical heartbeat that refused to stop. To enter was to surrender to its tempo. The moment a worker stepped through the door, speech became impossible. Conversation was replaced by gesture and instinct. Each movement of the hands became a note in the city's industrial music, precise and unending. For the owners, it was proof that order had triumphed over chaos. For the children who worked within it, it was simply the only world they knew. The smallest labourers were the most indispensable. They darted between looms, stooping to clear threads that jammed the shuttles or reached into gears too dangerous for adult arms. Some tied broken threads, Others swept the floor beneath the spinning frames. The youngest might stand on stools to reach their tasks, balancing for hours while the floor shook beneath them. They learned to keep their fingers flat, never curled, because a moment's hesitation could draw a hand into the teeth of the machinery. The noise drowned out the cries of those who forgot. Accidents were not rare enough to be remarkable. They were merely interruptions in production. The work itself followed the clock, not the sun. Shifts began before daylight and ended after it faded, the windows blackened by soot and dust until time lost its meaning. Children rose before dawn, ate crusts of bread on the walk to the factory, and returned home long after the streets had emptied. Their lives revolved around the rhythm of the whistle, one blast to begin, one to stop, and 12 or 14 hours between them. Fatigue became a habit, and sleep a luxury. The overseers called it discipline. To the reformers who occasionally visited, it looked more like captivity measured in minutes. Factories specialised in particular miseries. In textile mills, the air was thick with lint that clung to throats and lungs. Children developed a constant cough known as mill fever, a companion as reliable as hunger. In glassworks, they carried molten gobs from furnace to table, their skin perpetually blistered from the heat. The match factories glowed faintly in the dark, their fumes sweet and sickly. Here the workers, many of them girls barely in their teens, dipped sticks into white phosphorus, a chemical that ate through bone as surely as the machines chewed through cloth. The disease became known as phossy jaw, a slow rot that began with a toothache and ended with disfigurement or death. Supervisors called it an occupational hazard, as if the body were another expendable tool. To the employers and politicians who praised industry as moral education, these hardships were proof of character. Work, they argued, kept children out of vice. The factory was a school of virtue, where punctuality replaced idleness and obedience replaced temptation. Moralists congratulated themselves that the nation's poorest children were learning discipline at an early age, while conveniently overlooking the lesson being taught, that survival required silence and submission. A tired child was a good worker, a quiet one was a sign of progress. The discipline extended beyond the machines. Overseers carried whips or canes, striking without hesitation when a task slowed. Fines were deducted for lateness, broken threads, or dropped tools. Water was rationed to discourage lingering, and windows were kept shut to prevent distraction. Those who fainted from heat or exhaustion were dragged aside until they could stand again. Reformers described these places as prisons with wages, though the wages were rarely enough to justify the name. Still, the workers returned each morning, bound by necessity more effectively than by any chain. Despite the cruelty, there were moments when the factory resembled a form of society. Friendships formed in whispers between machines. Jokes were exchanged with the brevity that noise demanded. Children learned to read the expressions of the adults beside them, to sense danger in the flicker of an eye or the pitch of a sound. They grew fast and small at once, bodies aging while faces remained young. When they stood outside in daylight, their ears rang with the phantom rhythm of the looms, the sound continuing in memory long after the machinery stopped. Inspection came rarely, and when it did, the rooms were scrubbed and hours shortened for a day or two. The first factory acts had promised protection, but law without enforcement was only ceremony. Inspectors were too few, and their reach ended at the factory door. Employers cited the difficulty of finding replacements, the necessity of family labour, the benevolence of providing wages at all. Each excuse sounded reasonable enough to those not breathing the air inside. Meanwhile, the machines ran louder, and children continued to vanish into their rhythm. Mutilation was an accepted cost of efficiency. A hand lost to the gears was an accident, not an injustice, and often the injured returned to work within days performing tasks that required only one arm. Compensation, when offered, was deducted from future pay. Those who could no longer work drifted into street trades, selling matches or sweeping crossings. Different labours born from the same necessity, the city absorbed them easily. London was large enough to hide its broken machinery, whether made of iron or flesh. Religion offered little relief. Sermons praised the dignity of toil, urging the poor to accept hardship as divine design. Factory owners donated to church charities and built chapels for their workers, presenting faith as a salve for fatigue. The promise of salvation made endurance more tolerable, but it also ensured that endurance never ended. The moral language of labour turned suffering into virtue, transforming every blister and cough into evidence of righteousness. It was a logic that left no room for rest and none for rebellion. When reformers began to speak of limiting hours or banning the employment of children under a certain age, they met resistance not only from employers, but from the poor themselves. Parents feared starvation more than exploitation. A child kept home from the mill meant less food for everyone. Even when laws changed, habit remained. The working poor had been taught that survival was the highest form of morality, and the factory remained its temple. When the factory whistle fell silent, the city did not. Its rhythm merely changed key, shifting from the mechanical pulse of industry to the restless noise of the streets. London's pavements became another kind of workplace, open, unregulated, and endless. Here labour was not measured by a clock, but by daylight and endurance. For thousands of children, the street was both employer and enemy, promising freedom in exchange for exhaustion. They were the city's smallest merchants, bootblacks with brushes and tins, match sellers balancing trays, crossing sweepers, guarding patches of pavement like property. To the casual observer, they seemed almost independent, proof that even the poorest could thrive through hard work. To the children themselves, independence was merely the absence of protection. Street work required no apprenticeship and no permission, only a willingness to endure hunger and humiliation. The tools were simple: a brush, a bucket, a box of matches, and could be bought with a few pence or stolen from a careless rival. Each morning the children scattered through the streets, claiming corners and crossings as carefully as merchants claimed warehouses. The competition was fierce. A good spot near a theatre or railway could mean a meal. A bad one meant nothing but mud and cold. They learned to watch for constables whose patience with street sellers varied by mood and neighbourhood. A fine or a confiscated tray could erase a week's earnings, yet the work continued because there was no alternative. Weather ruled their fortunes. On dry days, the bootblacks prospered, polishing the shoes of clerks and officers, hurrying to their offices. When rain turned the streets to rivers, the sweepers earned their share, clearing paths for ladies afraid to soil their hems. Winter was the true enemy. Frost cracked the children's hands, and the gaslight glittered on pavements, too cold for bare feet. A few tried to sell flowers or oranges, their breath visible as they called out to passers-by. Many ended their nights huddled under bridges or in doorways, clutching the day's remaining matches for warmth. The city celebrated its endless activity, but its energy came from these small figures moving through the fog, unseen unless they were inconvenient. Henry Mayhew, the journalist who chronicled London's poor, described these children with a mixture of fascination and grief. He called them little traders, acknowledging both their resourcefulness and their fragility. His interviews revealed voices older than their years, speaking of profit and loss with the vocabulary of miniature businessmen. One boy told him he had learned to sell better by smiling. Another confessed he sometimes dirtied his own boots to seem like a customer before offering to clean them. Their cleverness was a survival tactic, not ambition. The illusion of freedom appealed to middle-class sensibilities. Respectable London liked to imagine that these children chose work over idleness, that their struggles proved the moral strength of the poor. Painters and writers turned them into sentimental figures, the cheerful sweep, the loyal newsboy, the ragged but honest match girl. The public preferred stories of perseverance to the quieter truth that most street children were trapped by circumstances older than they were. Their freedom was simply the lack of anyone obligated to care for them. A child who slept under a stall did not owe rent. A child who worked alone could not embarrass an employer. In this way, the city converted neglect into self-reliance and called it virtue. There was a hierarchy even among the unprotected. Newsboys clustered near railway stations, shouting headlines for papers they could barely read. They were louder and slightly better paid, though still easy targets for theft and assault. Bootblacks formed gangs to guard their corners and fought with rival groups using the same brushes they polished shoes with. Match sellers, often girls, were lowest of all, dependent on passing pity and vulnerable to anyone who mistook desperation for consent. A few worked under adult overseers who took their earnings in exchange for lodging and protection, arrangements that blurred the line between employment and exploitation. The work itself aged the children visibly, their posture bent from cold, their speech sharpened by bargaining, their laughter carrying the brittle edge of performance. They learned to flatter, to anticipate insults, to keep one eye on the customer and the other on the constable. Illness spread easily, bronchitis from damp air, fevers from hunger, frostbite that turned fingers black. Death rarely made the papers, unless it was picturesque. A frozen flower girl on Christmas morning could still stir donations. The dozens who simply vanished each winter drew no notice at all. Yet even in this landscape of endurance, moments of humour and solidarity persisted. Children shed crusts of bread, warned each other of police patrols, and built small alliances in markets and alleys. Mayhew noted that some referred to one another as mates, forming their own informal guilds of poverty. They pulled money for cheap lodging or took turns guarding a corner. These small gestures of community were the closest thing to stability they would ever know. When one fell ill or disappeared, the others absorbed his absence without ceremony, dividing his territory before dawn. Respectable society occasionally attempted to rescue street children, though the rescues often resembled imprisonment. Charitable homes and industrial schools promised moral education and steady work, but many of those who entered soon escaped. Freedom, however harsh, was preferable to institutional kindness. The same city that condemned idleness could not comprehend why its children resisted salvation. It was not rebellion, but instinct, an understanding that dependence was dangerous in a world that offered help only as discipline. The line between survival and crime was narrow, and many crossed it unintentionally. A matchbox short of money could lead to theft. A fight over a crossing could end in arrest. The courts treated these offences as moral failures, proof that the poor required stricter guidance. Magistrates lectured from behind polished desks, sending children to reformatories designed less to educate than to contain. The sentences were short, but the stigma lasted. Once labelled a delinquent, a child could no longer find legitimate work, returning to the streets by necessity. Thus, the illusion of freedom hardened into fact. They were free because no one wanted to claim them. Mayhew's observations recorded the contradiction perfectly. He wrote of a boy who declared he was his own master, though his income depended entirely on the weather and the kindness of strangers. Another insisted he liked the work because "no one tells me what to do," moments before admitting he hadn't eaten since morning. Their pride was genuine, but it lived beside hunger. The freedom of the streets was not the absence of chains, but the absence of doors. As industrial reformers turned their attention to factories and mines, the street traders remained outside every category, neither employed nor unemployed, neither children nor adults in the eyes of the law. They were living proof that labour could exist without structure, and that poverty needed no supervision to reproduce itself. The city tolerated them because they filled its corners and cleaned its boots, because they made visible the industrious spirit London liked to celebrate. To abolish their work would require confronting the poverty that created it, and that was something even reformers hesitated to attempt. The street was never the only refuge for London's poor. There was another kind of shelter, one surrounded by high walls and thick with the smell of disinfectant and boiled cabbage. It was called the workhouse, and it existed in every district of the city. Officially, it was a charitable institution, a place where the destitute could find food and safety in exchange for labour. In practice, it was a test of endurance designed to make poverty itself unbearable. Parliament had built it on the calculus of deterrence. If the workhouse were made unpleasant enough, only the truly desperate would enter. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 had redefined charity with bureaucratic precision. Under its rules, outdoor relief, help given directly to families in their own homes, was to be abolished. The poor would instead be relieved within the workhouse, a self-contained universe of discipline and deprivation. The goal, legislators claimed, was moral improvement. In reality, it was economy. Food, shelter, and labour could all be accounted for in ledgers. Poverty, once seen as misfortune, became a matter of efficiency. Every mouth fed had to justify its cost. The workhouse was not an act of mercy, but an experiment in social engineering. For the children who entered its gates, the distinction between punishment and salvation was impossible to see. Orphans arrived through the parish system, carried in from the streets, or deposited by exhausted parents who could no longer afford to keep them. The youngest were placed in nurseries, where thin milk and silence formed their first education. Older children were trained to work, grinding corn, picking oakum from old rope, or mending uniforms for soldiers. These tasks were not designed to teach a trade. They were meant to occupy the body and humble the spirit. Each movement reinforced the lesson that charity came with a price, and that idleness was the worst sin of all. The daily routine followed a clock more rigid than any factory's. Dawn brought inspection, prayers, and the weighing of food. Breakfast was a ladle of gruel or a scrap of bread, eaten under the supervision of a matron who recorded each portion. Conversation was forbidden. After the meal, the children marched to their assigned tasks. Boys to the workrooms, girls to the laundry or kitchen. They laboured until the afternoon, when they were allowed a brief meal and a half-hour of exercise in a walled yard. By evening, they were herded into dormitories lined with iron beds. Each child allotted a blanket and a number. Sleep came quickly, not from peace but from exhaustion. The workhouse presented itself as moral reform disguised as routine. Its architecture enforced obedience, corridors built for observation, doors that locked from the outside, windows too high to see through. Families were separated upon entry, husbands from wives, parents from children, so that affection could not interfere with order. Clergymen visited to remind inmates that poverty was a test of character and that gratitude was the appropriate response to survival. The walls echoed with hymns about humility, sung by people who had been stripped of everything else. For many Victorians, this system seemed merciful. Newspapers praised the institutions for reducing beggary. Reformers spoke of cleanliness and discipline as forms of salvation. The workhouse was proof that society cared, but only in ways that cost it little. Inside the walls, moral education took precedence over care. Children were told they had been rescued from vice, though their greatest crime was being born poor. They recited prayers about gratitude while their stomachs growled. The lessons were meant to prepare them for service in the outside world, as domestics, apprentices, or factory hands. Independence was the stated goal, but dependence was the outcome. Few ever left the workhouse better equipped for life. Most left simply older, smaller, and more obedient. Disease was an uninvited teacher. Overcrowding turned coughs into epidemics, and malnutrition made recovery unlikely. Death came quietly, recorded in ledgers alongside the daily expenditure of candles and soap. Small funerals took place behind the walls, attended by a clerk and a gravedigger. There was no scandal in these deaths because they followed the logic of thrift. The system lost less money than it spent. Outside the gates, London continued its debates about efficiency, unaware or unwilling to notice how precisely efficiency resembled neglect. Superintendents, often drawn from the middle classes, believed themselves benevolent. They kept orderly accounts, enforced hygiene, and trusted that routine would lead to redemption. Some showed kindness where rules allowed, offering a second helping of bread or a word of praise. Others treated discipline as principle, convinced that suffering purified the soul. In their ledgers, every improvement in conduct was a moral victory. Every complaint confirmed the need for stricter control. Compassion, when it appeared, was cautious and conditional. For orphans without family or name, the workhouse was both cradle and coffin. The institution provided everything necessary to survive, but nothing that made survival worthwhile. Friendships formed in whispers between chores, small conspiracies against monotony. Older children taught the younger how to endure inspections, how to steal an extra crust without being caught, how to cry without making noise. These were the practical lessons of charity, the knowledge that every comfort carried risk. A child who showed too much intelligence might be punished for insolence, while one who lagged behind was accused of sloth. The safest path was silence. Outside the walls, public tours occasionally allowed curious citizens to see their money at work. Visitors admired the neat rows of beds, the tidy kitchens, the silent order of the dining halls. They left reassured that poverty was being properly managed. No one lingered long enough to hear the echoes after the doors closed. The muffled sobs, the scraping of bowls, the coughs that never quite stopped. The workhouse existed to keep discomfort out of sight, transforming misery into proof of civic virtue. Within this system, orphans and pauper children became living symbols of Victorian contradictions, objects of pity who justified the very laws that oppressed them. Their endurance reassured society that the moral order remained intact, that suffering had meaning. To remove them from the workhouse would have required admitting that poverty was structural, not personal, and that charity alone could never undo the damage. Few were ready for that conclusion. The poor law's machinery continued to turn, smooth and well-oiled, fed by the steady supply of the desperate. Behind the walls of respectable London homes, another kind of labour took place, silent, invisible, and unending. The city's wealth relied not only on its factories and streets, but on the work performed in rooms that never appeared in public reports. Here, in the dim attics of seamstresses and the servants' quarters of middle-class households, girls barely into adolescence stitched, scrubbed, and carried until their hands shook. Their work was less dangerous than the factory floor, but no less consuming. The soot-stained chimneys and roaring machines at least produced visible smoke. Domestic and home-based labour left nothing but exhaustion as evidence. Many of these girls began as pauper apprentices, transferred from workhouses into private service. Others were sent by their families. their small wages supporting parents or younger siblings. Some were orphans taken in by charity, though charity often resembled employment under another name. The uniform might change: a coarse grey dress for a workhouse girl, a simple pinafore for a maid, but the hierarchy did not. In a society obsessed with moral order, servitude was considered proper training for womanhood. A good servant learned patience, humility, and silence. She was expected to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to move quietly through rooms that were never hers, and to vanish when no longer required. In middle-class homes, the rhythm of service followed the household clock. The maid-of-all-work rose before the family, lit the fires, carried water, and prepared breakfast without tasting it. She spent the rest of the day cleaning, laundering, and mending until the house itself seemed to consume her energy. The labour was constant but unseen, measured not by tasks completed but by the absence of complaint. A servant who fell ill might be dismissed for bringing misfortune to the household. One who grew pregnant faced immediate dismissal and public disgrace. In theory, the servant's loyalty brought her security. In practice, it only deepened dependence. For those who sewed instead of scrubbing, the work offered little more dignity. In cramped garrets overlooking narrow streets, seamstresses stitched shirts and dresses for hours that blurred together. Payment was by the piece: 3p for a waistcoat, a few shillings for a dozen shirts. A girl might work 16 hours to earn enough for bread and lodging, her eyes burning from candle smoke, her fingers bleeding from the needle's constant bite. They called it needlewomen's work, as though delicacy redeemed the monotony. In truth, the seamstress was trapped between exhaustion and debt. When her sight failed, she was replaced by another, younger pair of hands. The match factories offered a different kind of torment. There, girls as young as 12 dipped wooden sticks into white phosphorus, their faces illuminated by the faint chemical glow. The air shimmered with invisible poison that seeped into gums and jawbones. A toothache could mark the beginning of phossy jaw. Managers dismissed the illness as exaggeration, claiming the sufferers had neglected hygiene or lacked moral discipline. The real crime was poverty, which made the work necessary. The match girls sang to distract themselves from the smell, their laughter thin as the sulphur they breathed. In 1888, they would strike for better pay and safer conditions. But in the early decades, their songs went unheard. Domestic service and home industry shared the same moral disguise. Both were praised as honest labour, free from the corruption of the streets. Reformers pointed to these girls as examples of virtue rescued from vice. The reality was quieter and lonelier. Many lived where they worked, sleeping in attics or basements, with little heat and no privacy. Letters home were censored or discouraged, friendships rare. In some houses, servants were forbidden from speaking during meals or entering certain rooms. They learned to communicate through glances, through the rhythm of footsteps on the stairs. Their lives were lived in the margins of other people's comfort. The relationship between mistress and servant was often described in sentimental language: care, mentorship, moral guidance, but it relied on obedience enforced by dependence. A servant's livelihood could vanish with a word, her reputation with a rumour. Some employers prided themselves on kindness, granting small gifts or holidays, but even kindness reinforced hierarchy. Gratitude was expected. Loyalty was measured by silence. The servant knew every habit of the household, its tempers, its secrets, its waste, and yet remained invisible. For seamstresses and factory girls, invisibility meant anonymity. They worked in spaces hidden from public view, crowded lofts, rented basements, candle-lit rooms that smelled of wax and fatigue. The city admired the dresses they made and the matches they produced, but never asked who created them. The finished goods appeared in shop windows without fingerprints. Even reformers struggled to imagine these workers as individuals. Reports spoke of female operatives and needlewomen, reducing thousands of lives to categories on paper. The language of compassion became statistical, turning misery into evidence for debate. Religion and morality offered little relief. Clergymen praised the domestic servant's chastity, the seamstress's modesty, the matchgirl's cheerfulness. Each quality was useful because it demanded no change. Virtue in this sense was endurance made holy. When a servant died young or disappeared into illness, her employer might remark on her diligence as though it were a memorial. No monuments were built for those who polished the monuments of others. The work itself consumed more than time. It bent the spine, ruined eyesight, and dulled sensation. Girls spoke of pricking their fingers until they no longer felt the pain. In winter, they sewed with gloves cut at the fingertips to keep their hands moving. Some whispered prayers as they worked, asking not for release but for enough light to finish the day's quota. The prayers were practical, measured in stitches and meals. Their faith, like their labour, was quiet and persistent. A few managed to save enough to escape, marrying a tradesman, opening a small shop, or securing a position in a larger household with slightly better conditions. For every success, dozens remained trapped in the same cycle, growing older in service until their usefulness faded. When age or illness finally ended their employment, they faced the same fate as those they had once served: the workhouse, the charity ward, or the street. Respectability had no memory. The city's prosperity relied on their silence. Every polished railing, every pressed collar, every lit lamp depended on invisible labour performed by hands too young to vote, too poor to refuse. The wealth that lined London's drawing rooms was stitched, scrubbed, and kindled by girls who rarely saw the world beyond the threshold. Their names were unrecorded, their wages unspent on themselves, their exhaustion repackaged as virtue. As factories multiplied and London's wealth expanded, the boundaries between domestic and industrial labour blurred entirely. The same moral code that kept servants obedient also governed the workshops. Obedience, silence, modesty. Work became an extension of virtue, and virtue a justification for endless work. The city's progress was measured by production, not by well-being. Behind closed doors, candlelight flickered on walls the colour of fatigue, illuminating hands that never stopped moving. London's households slept peacefully above them, unaware that their comfort rested on the quiet industry of those who did not. The hidden labour of women and girls formed the unseen heartbeat of the city, steady, constant, and unacknowledged. It was the rhythm that filled the silence left when the machines stopped, the pulse that kept the great city breathing. Reform in Victorian London did not begin with law, but with language. Before the city could imagine saving its children, it first had to learn how to see them. For decades, poverty had been treated as scenery, part of the fog that hung over the streets, unpleasant but inevitable. What changed was not the suffering itself, but the growing discomfort of those who had the leisure to notice it. Out of that discomfort emerged a new generation of moralists and reformers who believed that words could penetrate soot as effectively as sunlight. Their sermons, essays, and novels became lanterns held up to the smog, revealing faces that polite society preferred to keep in shadow. Lord Shaftesbury was among the first to give this moral unease a political vocabulary. A conservative by class and temperament, he nevertheless treated reform as a duty rather than a rebellion. His campaigns for shorter working hours, factory inspection, and the regulation of child labour were couched in the language of Christian stewardship. The strong were obliged to protect the weak. He saw poverty not as a sign of divine punishment, but as an opportunity for moral testing, both for the poor, who must endure with dignity, and for the rich, who must practice mercy. His speeches in Parliament framed reform as preservation, not revolution. The children of the poor, he argued, were not the enemies of order, but its victims. Still, even compassion had to justify itself economically. Shaftesbury reassured his peers that a healthier workforce was also a more productive one, that conscience could coexist with profit. Charles Dickens took a different approach. His weapon was not law but empathy sharpened by irony. Having known childhood labour himself, he wrote about it with a familiarity that stripped away abstraction. In Oliver Twist, the workhouse became a microcosm of institutional cruelty disguised as benevolence. David Copperfield and Hard Times turned factories and schools into theatres of endurance, where children learned that obedience was their only defence against starvation. Dickens never claimed to speak as a politician or philosopher. He spoke as a witness, insisting that the poor were not moral lessons but human beings. His novels circulated through every stratum of society, read by the same classes they indicted. Some readers wept, others scoffed. The sentimentality that made his stories powerful also made them easy to dismiss. The privileged could cry over a character and then return to their dinner, comforted by the thought that awareness itself was virtue. Henry Mayhew, less celebrated but equally vital, preferred the authority of observation. His London Labour and the London Poor catalogued the lives of street vendors, beggars, and labourers with the precision of an anthropologist. Where Dickens sought the heart, Mayhew pursued the ledger. He interviewed costermongers, sweepers, and matchgirls, recording their words with minimal commentary. The result was a kind of democratic archive, a portrait of the city assembled from its margins. His writing lacked the theatrical sympathy of Dickens, but it replaced sentiment with evidence, an unembellished record that no moralist could easily deny. Yet even Mayhew's realism struggled against indifference. His readers found the poor fascinating, not urgent. They preferred the curiosity of misery to its implications. These reformers shared an unspoken frustration. Their discoveries, once published, often served as reassurance rather than provocation. The act of reading about suffering became a substitute for addressing it. Charitable societies multiplied, offering alms and education in doses small enough to preserve the structure that produced need. The public applauded each new effort, but resisted the idea that the system itself required change. When Shaftesbury proposed further restrictions on labour, critics warned of economic collapse. When Dickens denounced institutional cruelty, reviewers accused him of exaggeration. When Mayhew revealed the hidden architecture of poverty, politicians complained that he undermined public confidence. Compassion was tolerated only when it arrived in polite language. Victorian reform existed within a paradox. The age prided itself on moral seriousness, yet distrusted feeling as weakness. The same newspapers that serialised Dickens' novels published editorials condemning sentimental interference in commerce. Factory owners mocked reformers as professional sympathisers. Clergymen cautioned that charity could corrupt by making the poor dependent. Even within Parliament, compassion had to be disguised as efficiency, empathy translated into pragmatism. The suffering of children was acknowledged but reframed as a technical issue, one to be managed rather than mourned. Still, the moral climate was changing. Sermons began to speak less of personal sin and more of collective responsibility. Middle-class readers, confronted by descriptions of hunger and filth, started visiting the neighbourhoods they had long ignored. They went not as equals but as spectators, touring slums with the same curiosity they brought to museums. The experience shocked them, and some returned with renewed zeal for reform. Philanthropic missions sprang up across London. Soup kitchens, ragged schools, orphan asylums. Their founders believed they were building ladders out of poverty, though many of those ladders led only back to the same streets. Reformers learned to harness publicity as a tool. Engravings of child labourers appeared in illustrated journals, sermons quoted parliamentary reports, and petitions circulated through drawing rooms. Each new revelation competed for attention in a city already crowded with causes. Yet the problem remained too vast to capture in a single narrative. For every law passed or charity established, new children filled the streets and factories. Reformers could not outpace the economy that produced them. The very visibility of the poor created fatigue. The public grew accustomed to compassion as background noise. Sympathy, like soot, settled on everything and changed nothing. Among the upper classes, ridicule became a form of defence. Cartoonists lampooned reformers as self-righteous meddlers, and newspapers accused them of romanticising filth. Philanthropy, one editorial declared, has become the latest fashion accessory. The accusation stung because it was partly true. Charity dinners and fundraising galas allowed the wealthy to display generosity without altering the conditions that made generosity necessary. Reform threatened comfort, and comfort had its defenders. It was safer to admire the moralists than to imitate them. Even those most dedicated to change struggled with contradiction. Shaftesbury opposed factory cruelty, yet supported missionary work that imposed discipline on the same children he sought to protect. Dickens preached compassion, but mocked certain reformers for sanctimony. Mayhew's detailed observations carried the bias of his era, describing the poor as a separate species shaped by environment. None of them escaped the limitations of their time, but together they achieved something enduring. They turned the invisible into the undeniable. The reformers had not remade the city, but they had altered its imagination. They forced London to hear the sound beneath its prosperity. The cough in the factory, the shuffle of feet in the street, the silence in the workhouse dormitory. Their words did not clear the smoke, but they named it. And naming is its own kind of rebellion. From that language of conscience, new debates emerged about law, education, and the limits of responsibility. The struggle between compassion and complacency was far from resolved, but it had entered the public vocabulary. As London congratulated itself on its growing morality, the first serious questions began to arise about how that morality would be enforced and by whom. The moral awakening that reformers hoped would transform Victorian London met its equal and opposite force in the logic of denial. For every pamphlet pleading for the protection of children, there was another insisting that such protection threatened the very foundations of British prosperity. Industry, its defenders claimed, was not merely an economic system, but a moral one. Work built character. Discipline bred virtue. Idleness, as every sermon repeated, led straight to crime. The poor were to be saved not by comfort, but by toil. To question that principle was to question the moral order that defined the empire itself. Industrialists spoke with the confidence of men who believed their success proof of divine favour. They viewed reformers with suspicion, dismissing them as sentimental meddlers who understood nothing of business or necessity. A factory owner might admit that long hours were regrettable or that accidents were tragic, but he would insist they were unavoidable. The price of progress. Machines demanded precision, and precision required human sacrifice. In his view, every society must choose between suffering and stagnation. Better to burn out a few young lives than to slow the march of invention. Employers who used child labour often argued they were performing a social service, providing work where otherwise there would be crime. To them, a child in a mill was safer than a child in an alley. Parliament echoed these justifications. Members spoke in measured tones about the dangers of overregulation, warning that interference with industry would lead to unemployment and social unrest. They praised the industrious classes while quietly ensuring those classes remained dependent. Inspectors might report abuses, but legislation was drafted to avoid offending those whose wealth filled the state's coffers. Even well-intentioned politicians preferred compromise to confrontation. The nation's prosperity, they reminded each other, rested on the competitive advantage of cheap labour. Compassion was admirable in principle, but ruinous in practice. The newspapers, eager to defend their readers' comfort, framed the debate as one of freedom versus interference. Editorials condemned reformers for undermining self-reliance, portraying the poor as grateful participants in their own hardship. Articles described factory children as cheerful and industrious, their endurance proof of the British spirit. Photographs and illustrations showing ragged workers were often accompanied by captions celebrating honest labour. The tone of moral pride disguised the fact that few journalists had ever entered a factory without supervision. To the middle class, these narratives provided reassurance. The empire's progress was righteous because it was productive. The churches reinforced this moral calculus from the pulpit. Sermons praised obedience as the highest Christian virtue and warned against the sin of envy. Clergymen urged parishioners to accept their stations in life as part of divine design. Suffering, they said, was a test of faith, labour its reward. The wealthy were instructed to show charity, but never indulgence. The poor were reminded that heaven favoured the humble. When reformers invoked Christian compassion to condemn exploitation, their arguments met a wall of theology carefully built to justify the status quo. It was easier for the church to sanctify endurance than to confront the system that demanded it. Behind the moral arguments lay economic fear. Industry had grown dependent on the pliant labour of children, whose small hands and low wages made certain trades profitable. Removing them from the workforce meant reorganising production, investing in machinery, or paying adults more, steps many employers viewed as threats to survival. They warned that reform would destroy livelihoods and drive families deeper into poverty. In a grim irony, they claimed that compassion would harm the very children it sought to protect. Poverty became both the cause and the excuse for exploitation. So long as hunger existed, labour was inevitable. And so long as labour was inevitable, moral scrutiny could be dismissed as naivety. Even after the passage of the Factory Acts and similar reforms, enforcement remained a polite fiction. Inspectors were appointed in numbers too small to matter. Their territories so vast they could visit each mill, perhaps once a year. Many were former tradesmen or local gentlemen, reluctant to offend their peers. Reports were filed and quietly shelved. Fines were imposed and later forgiven. Bribes were common, couched as donations or hospitality. A foreman might tidy a factory for inspection, instructing children to hide until the visitor left. Others simply falsified birth records, claiming that 10-year-olds were 13. The bureaucracy of virtue became another industry in itself, producing paperwork rather than change. Opponents of reform often accused inspectors of exaggeration or deceit. When evidence of abuse appeared too undeniable to ignore, they shifted strategy, framing it as the exception rather than the rule. A few bad masters, they would say, should not condemn the many who treat their workers fairly. It was an argument that required no proof and invited no contradiction. Meanwhile, those bad masters continued to profit. The persistence of exploitation became its own defence. If cruelty endured despite repeated outrage, perhaps it was simply natural. The moral blindness extended beyond the factories into the homes that consumed their products. Middle-class families purchased cheap cloth and matches without considering the cost in human lives. They employed servants drawn from the same impoverished ranks and congratulated themselves on their generosity. The distance between production and consumption made denial effortless. Conscience was dulled by convenience, and convenience was the defining luxury of the age. Even those who professed sympathy for the poor preferred reforms that demanded little sacrifice. The intellectual elite supplied philosophical justifications for this indifference. Economists invoked the laws of supply and demand, declaring that intervention would distort the natural order of markets. Social theorists argued that poverty was an essential incentive, keeping the lower classes industrious and the upper classes vigilant. The doctrine of self-help, popularized by Samuel Smiles, taught that personal effort could overcome any obstacle. If a few exceptional individuals escaped the slums, their stories were used to dismiss the millions who could not. The system rewarded its own myths, turning rare fortune into proof that failure was voluntary. Resistance to reform was not always cynical. Often it was simply habitual. The rhythm of labour, poverty, and endurance had become so woven into daily life that many could not imagine the city without it. Employers feared chaos, workers feared starvation, politicians feared responsibility. Reform required imagining a different moral economy, one where profit was not the highest virtue, and imagination was in short supply. The inertia of custom carried more weight than any sermon or law. The moralists who had exposed the city's contradictions found themselves outnumbered by defenders of the ordinary. Progress was measured in language rather than action. Employers learned to describe their factories as model establishments. Newspapers adopted the vocabulary of reform without altering their assumptions. The empire congratulated itself on compassion while continuing to consume the labour of its poor. London's conscience had been awakened, but it preferred to close its eyes. By the time official reports acknowledged that enforcement was inconsistent and corruption widespread, the debate had already shifted. Reformers now faced the subtler challenge of hypocrisy rather than ignorance. The nation claimed virtue while quietly preserving vice, comforted by the appearance of progress. Compassion had become another commodity, sold in sermons and serialized novels. The question was no longer whether the city would change, but whether it wanted to. In this atmosphere of contradiction, child labour persisted like the fog that refused to lift. Thinner in some streets, thicker in others, but always present. The defenders of industry continued to praise hard work as moral salvation, even as the evidence of suffering grew impossible to deny. Reform had produced laws. Denial ensured they remained unread. The machine of progress hummed on, its gears greased by habit and self-interest. Only when its rhythm faltered would the city begin to wonder whether endurance alone could still be called virtue. The story of reform in Victorian England is often told as a triumph of conscience, a steady march from darkness into light. In speeches and schoolbooks, the Factory Acts stand as milestones of moral progress, proof that the nation could correct itself without revolution. Yet for those who lived among the chimneys and the mills, progress arrived not as rescue, but as paperwork. Laws were written faster than they were enforced, and each new regulation served as both confession and disguise. Reform became a ritual performance, carried out on paper, so that the empire might look at its own reflection and see benevolence staring back. The first Factory Act of 1833 was introduced with solemn ceremony, a declaration that the state could no longer ignore the exhaustion of its children. It prohibited the employment of anyone under 9 in textile factories, limited the hours of work for those aged 9 to 13 to 48 per week, and promised education for at least 2 hours each day. 4 inspectors were appointed to oversee compliance across the whole of Britain. In London, the announcement was greeted with applause. In the mills, with laughter. 4 men to police thousands of workshops was not regulation, it was symbolism. Factory owners quickly learned to tidy their floors when a visit was rumoured, to falsify birth certificates, and to send the smallest children home until the danger had passed. The law's moral authority was never matched by its reach. The 1833 Act established a pattern that would repeat for decades. Each new law arrived like a sermon, worthy, cautious, and written in the language of compromise. The 1844 Factory Act extended protections to women, limiting their hours and mandating the fencing of dangerous machinery. It sounded merciful, but even these modest reforms met resistance from those who claimed the poor would starve if they were not allowed to work themselves to death. Employers soon discovered that the simplest way to obey the law was to interpret it creatively. Machines were fenced, but too low to matter. Children were registered as helpers or apprentices, titles that fell outside the statute. Inspectors filed reports describing accidents, illnesses, and deceit, while Parliament congratulated itself on its humanitarian achievement. The Empire had found a new form of virtue. It could exploit and apologise at the same time. 3 years later, the 10 Hours Act of 1847 sought to end this ambiguity. It promised a maximum 10-hour workday for women and younger workers in the textile trades, a limit hailed as a victory for morality and domestic stability. Supporters claimed it would strengthen families by allowing mothers and daughters to return home before nightfall. Opponents predicted economic collapse. In practice, both sides were wrong. Mill owners simply rearranged shifts, spreading the same workload across longer weeks or forcing workers to complete voluntary overtime. Enforcement was left to the same overstretched inspectors, whose authority was more moral than practical. Some genuinely believed their presence improved conditions. Others treated the post as honorary, more a mark of civic standing than a vocation. Reports were drafted in the language of optimism, their statistics selective, their conclusions mild. Reform had become theatre, performed for an audience that preferred sentiment to change. By the 1860s, Parliament had developed an entire genre of legislation devoted to self-congratulation. The 1864 and 1867 Factory Acts extended coverage to more industries, brickyards, pottery works, paper mills, but still relied on complaint-driven enforcement. The burden of proof fell upon those least able to provide it. A child injured by machinery could scarcely afford the time or literacy to submit a report, and parents feared dismissal if they spoke. Each year, the Home Office received tidy stacks of forms detailing compliance, certificates of age, lists of apprentices, signatures of factory owners affirming their virtue. The paperwork grew thicker, even as the walls of the mills remained unchanged. In a society that equated bureaucracy with progress, the illusion of order was more persuasive than the reality of care. The final consolidation came with the 1878 Factory and Workshop Act, a document so comprehensive that it seemed to settle the question forever. It prohibited the employment of children under 10, established a half-day limit for those aged 10 to 14, and required at least 10 hours of schooling per week. For the first time, the law claimed jurisdiction over both factories and smaller workshops. Inspectors increased in number, and magistrates gained authority to prosecute offenders. On paper, the Victorian conscience had matured. In practice, the Act created an empire of clerks. Every regulation required documentation, every exemption a form. Employers learned that compliance was easier to fake than to follow. They built offices for the filing of certificates, hired clerks to manage signatures, and regarded inspection not as intrusion, but as routine. The moral machinery of reform began to mirror the industrial machinery it sought to tame. Efficient, impersonal, and relentless. What the Acts accomplished most successfully was reassurance. The middle class could now believe that the suffering of the poor was being managed by law, that compassion had been delegated to government. Newspapers celebrated the legislation as proof of national virtue, praising Britain for its unique humanity. Sermons cited the Factory Acts as evidence that Christian ethics guided the state. The laws themselves became symbols of identity, woven into the narrative of imperial moral superiority. A society capable of regulating cruelty could not, by definition, be cruel. The factories continued to hum, but now their noise was accompanied by the rustle of paper, petitions, reports, and certificates fluttering like moral credentials in the bureaucratic wind. For the children, the difference was barely visible. A 10-year-old still rose before dawn, walked through the fog, and worked until the body ached. The age of legality changed nothing about the necessity of hunger. Inspectors rarely visited, and when they did, foremen staged rehearsals of compliance. A child might be sent home for the day, only to return the next morning. In households where every penny counted, the law's protection became another burden. If a boy was too young to work legally, his family faced starvation. If he worked illegally, they risked punishment. The line between mercy and cruelty was drawn in ink rather than experience. Reformers themselves began to feel the fatigue of victory. Each new act required celebration, each celebration an admission that the problem persisted. Parliamentary debates grew repetitive, their phrases interchangeable. The welfare of the child, the dignity of labour, the progress of civilization. The moral urgency that had once animated the reform movement hardened into habit. Lawmaking became a performance of virtue rather than a pursuit of justice. Even critics of the system participated in its rituals, drafting proposals and attending committees that produced little beyond sentiment. The empire had found its equilibrium between conscience and convenience. The bureaucratic rhythm of reform mirrored the industrial rhythm it regulated, steady, mechanical, and indifferent to the human beings caught within it. Reports accumulated as children aged out of the statistics that were meant to protect them. Inspectors retired with honours, factory owners adjusted their ledgers, and Parliament prepared to revisit the issue once public attention wavered. The Factory Acts were not failures so much as mirrors, reflecting the nation's need to appear righteous, while avoiding the cost of righteousness. Progress had been achieved, but only on paper. The closing decades of the 19th century brought a new kind of reformer, one who spoke not of factories or workshops, but of classrooms. After generations of measuring children by their usefulness, Britain began to imagine a different standard. The child not as labourer but as pupil. It was a fragile revolution, conducted not through revolutionaries but through administrators. Parliament, tired of the moral disputes surrounding labour laws, found education an acceptable form of compassion, an investment that could be justified as economic foresight. The state would now teach the poor not for their happiness but for the efficiency of the empire. Still, the change marked a turning point. The Education Acts of 1870 and the decades that followed attempted something unprecedented: to invent childhood itself as a protected stage of life. Before 1870, schooling for the working class was a matter of chance and charity. A few attended Sunday schools, funded by local parishes. Others learned their letters in ragged schools, informal institutions that offered instruction alongside soup. These lessons were irregular, shaped by the availability of funds and the demands of labour. For most families, education remained a luxury that could be purchased only with hunger. A day spent in class was a day without wages. The Education Act of 1870 known as Forster's Act, sought to correct this imbalance by establishing publicly funded board schools. Local authorities were granted the power to build classrooms, hire teachers, and charge small fees to parents. Attendance was encouraged but not yet enforced. The law's tone was pragmatic rather than visionary. It promised neither equality nor enlightenment, merely that ignorance would no longer be national policy. The implementation was predictably uneven. Wealthier districts built respectable schools with brick facades and high windows. Poorer parishes struggled to provide desks and heat. Classrooms filled faster than they could be expanded, and teachers, often young women with minimal training, faced rooms of 60 or more children. The curriculum emphasized discipline over imagination, reading, writing, arithmetic, and scripture, drilled with military precision. Inspectors measured progress by penmanship and silence. Learning to obey was as important as learning to read. The schoolroom became a new kind of factory. Its product, not cloth or matches, but conformity. Yet for all its shortcomings, it introduced the radical notion that the poor were capable of instruction, that intellect was not the privilege of birth. The Education Act of 1880 made attendance compulsory for children between the ages of 5 and 10. Later amendments extended the age to 11, then 12. The state, having first condemned idleness as a moral failing, now rebranded absence from school as a crime. Truant officers patrolled the streets, armed with registers and fines. Parents who kept their children home for work risked prosecution, though the magistrates themselves often sympathised with their predicament. For families living on the edge of subsistence, a child's labour could mean the difference between rent paid and eviction. The law's compassion came at their expense. Attendance, like every other reform, was easiest for those who needed it least. In theory, the Education Acts created opportunity. In practice, they deepened the line between the working poor and the destitute. Children from respectable labouring families trudged to school in patched boots, clutching slates and tin lunches. Those from the slums arrived barefoot or not at all. Illness, hunger, and distance remained powerful deterrents. Many schools charged small fees that accumulated into debts. Others required uniforms or supplies that families could not afford. Philanthropic societies attempted to bridge the gap with donations of clothing or meals, but charity could not keep pace with need. Inspectors recorded attendance in the language of optimism, percentages and averages that transformed absence into pragmatism. In the reports, the poor were improving. In reality, they were simply adjusting. For the children who did attend, the experience was both liberation and constraint. The classroom offered warmth, structure, and occasional kindness, a rare respite from labour. At the same time, it replaced one hierarchy with another. Corporal punishment remained common. Moral instruction favoured obedience to authority over critical thought. Lessons on empire and religion taught children to equate virtue with submission. Yet even within these boundaries, something new began to grow. A child who learned to read gained access to a world beyond the factory and the parish. Books circulated through classrooms and libraries, opening windows onto lives unmeasured by wages. Literacy became a quiet form of rebellion, a skill that could not be taken back to the employer's ledger. The rhetoric surrounding education revealed the contradictions of the age. Reformers celebrated the moral elevation of the working classes, yet the system they built reinforced social order. The goal was not to erase inequality, but to manage it more gracefully. Schools were expected to produce dutiful citizens, not visionaries. Religious instruction taught humility. Civic lessons praised the empire as a benevolent family, its hierarchy divinely ordained. Girls were trained for domestic service or motherhood. boys for trades. The very structure of schooling mirrored the industrial world outside. Efficiency, repetition, and hierarchy disguised as virtue. Childhood newly discovered was already being disciplined into usefulness. Despite these limitations, the expansion of education left traces of genuine transformation. Literacy rates rose steadily, and with them came the beginnings of political awareness. Former students became clerks, teachers, and journalists, carrying the language of their lessons into public life. The press expanded to meet the appetite of a new reading public. Penny newspapers and serialized novels found eager audiences among workers who had once been excluded from print. Dickens, whose novels had once been read aloud in workshops, was now read in silence by those he had described. Education, however imperfect, had turned compassion into comprehension. Yet the myth of universal schooling masked persistent inequality. Rural areas lagged behind the cities, and in London's poorest districts, attendance remained sporadic. Inspectors reported children sleeping through lessons, their bodies still recovering from early morning chores. Others arrived hungry, their concentration breaking before noon. Teachers supplemented lessons with charity, offering scraps of food or warmth from the classroom stove. The state congratulated itself on success while relying on unpaid devotion to sustain it. For many educators, reform meant not new resources, but new responsibilities, keeping children alive long enough to learn. The invention of childhood brought with it a new set of expectations. The child was now seen as innocent, malleable, and in need of protection. Literature and art echoed this sentiment, filling galleries and magazines with images of rosy-cheeked pupils and patient teachers. Society romanticized learning, even as it neglected the conditions that made it possible. The same politicians who praised the virtue of education resisted funding it adequately. The same newspapers that glorified school attendance condemned taxation to support it. The child had become a symbol of the nation's conscience, useful for speeches, less so for budgets. Still, the act of defining childhood as something distinct from labour altered the moral landscape. Once, a child's value had been measured by productivity. Now, at least in theory, it was measured by potential. The transition was incomplete and inconsistent, but it changed the language of reform. Protecting children no longer meant simply limiting their hours of work. It meant preserving their capacity to learn. The classroom replaced the factory as the moral centre of debate, and literacy became the new measure of progress. Modern London no longer smells of coal smoke. The air drifts clean between glass towers that catch the light like monuments to renewal. The river runs clearer, the factories have moved elsewhere, and the city congratulates itself on progress. Yet every polished street rests on the same foundation of fatigue. The soot has been scrubbed away, but the silence beneath it remains. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.